all things are circular in human life. So they somehow come back to where they started, or they somehow start to where they're going to come back to. I started, I think, my theatrical career when I was very young. I remember very early on loving to dance, and I don't mean any organized dance, I mean just kind of expressive movement to movement when I was very young. And there were a number of incidents, one of which, the only concussion I ever had, I couldn't have been more than 3, and I don't know how they let me do it or why, but it was on the kitchen table that I was moving, and I fell and hit my head on the radiator, and that was the only concussion in my whole life. And I remember that my uncle Zick, the doctor, the 3rd son of my grandfather, 6 Edelman sons, came and looked at it, and I don't remember what he did with it, but he did something with my head, and I've never been the same. And but my mother, who fed my artistic impulses, I don't know if I had an artistic impulse until she instilled them into me, but certainly it was with my mother that I started my career as an artist. And she enrolled me in expressive dance classes at the Brooklyn Academy of Music band, which was a different animal in those days. At any rate, in a very large room, a big room, high ceilinged. I have an early recollection of flitting around in a kind of Greek, what are they called?
A Greek toga?
But a short one. I forget the name of it. Flitting around that, around the room, to some kind of music or some kind of beat. And I think it was an acolyte of Isadora Duncan's who was teaching it. To say that all things come round, years later when I was in France, many years later, the Beaux-Arts offered me a position of going to work as the assistant to her husband. They were long since separated. She had long since been dead in that famous death when she was choked to death with that long scarf getting caught in the wheels of the sports car, the open sports car that she was driving in. And her husband, whose name escapes me, I mean, I know it very well, a descendant of Ellen Terry's, no less, who was a very important designer, stage designer and director, was in his old age, living in the south of France, and he needed an assistant. And the Beaux-Arts offered me this job, and it was one of the decisions, I don't even know if it was a decision, but I did not take it through and that was one of these decisions in life where my life might have gone one way.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it went another way. And then there were other dance classes at the Brooklyn Museum, big import museum, where I also took a somewhat similar dance class. These were all when I was very young, 5, 6, 7 years old. And I don't remember who or what taught that, or what they were teaching, or any of that. And those were my earliest recollections of some kind of performance art, something really connected to the theater. The next recollections, I think in my 5th grade in public school, there was a play going to be given, and the lead was in contention, and I remember speaking to Miss or Mrs. Cochetts, who was the teacher, and promoting myself to play the lead. And that lead had to be in something like a wheelchair, which we didn't have at school or anything like that. But I went out and found a carriage where you sat up in, well, I don't remember what they called, but you sat up in a carriage when you were a child, and you pushed.
Uh-huh.
It was, I don't remember.
Like a stroller?
Like a stroller, that's right, a stroller. And I think it was woven, and I brought it in, and that clinched it for me. So I was in that play. I don't remember anything before that. There must have been, but I don't recall. And then the next thing I immediately remember is there was a community cultural organization that had a performance and play group, and I guess I was about 11 or 12. And believe it or not, I played a racist role. I played Topsy, but not in blackface, just in gray. But my hair tied up as Topsy's were in white little pieces of cloth. I don't remember anything more about it but that. And then the next thing I remember, then it began to be, I was in junior high school next, and then it was getting more organized, much more focused. And among other things, by default, I was elected the handsomest boy in the school.
Oh.
There was another boy who was ahead of me, but for some reason he was eliminated. And I had nothing to do with the elimination. But I got to be the handsomest boy in the school. And right around then too, we had a recitation contest, and I won in the recitation. I was getting there by then. I was moving along. And I recited Gunga Din. And I remember some of it even yet.
Wow.
With what I thought was a a kind of British accent. And I was well responded to by the audience, by the students and the teachers and all that. And it was ambitious for our neighborhood. But Mr. Levine, I think he was, the assistant principal, decided I should not get it. Instead, a girl who recited a poem, "I Am an American," he thought she should get it. So I went to his office to see him about it, to plead my case. And I remember my saying to him, "But I had the sexual appeal." I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded right. It didn't work. So I didn't win that award. And there must have been some plays, but I don't remember them at junior high school. I then went on to high school, and this was at Lafayette High School, which was, I think, a year old when we got there. There was a class that entered as freshmen the year before. We did not, because being a junior high school, we did the first year of high school and junior high school, and then went on. So we were amongst the first graduating classes there. Brand new school, and they had a terrific teaching staff because they invested in it to get the school going. Wonderful teachers and wonderful programs. It has since now, 70 some odd years later, become the most dangerous school in New York City, at Lafayette High School. But at that point it certainly wasn't. It grew from a population of very upwardly mobile working class, Jews primarily and the like, and Italians and people who were striving to make it in the American society with a big investment in education. And it had a wonderful theater section, and that's where I really began to develop some sense of insight, some insight into what might be required of me in theater. It was, it was clear I wasn't going to be a dancer, no way. I wasn't built right, and I didn't have that sense of rhythm or that sort of thing. And it never occurred to me that beyond when I was very young to be a dancer. But I clearly was blessed with a very good voice. And through no effort of mine, I just was blessed with it. And I had an ear for a more refined American or Anglo-American accent that served well for the stage. And so I was in plays there, 3-act plays and that sort of thing, 1-act plays, 3-act plays, and classes too in theater and acting. And that's where I got my real beginning of whatever chops I then developed, started there. And while I was there, I had a number of good friends, and one of them, Jerry Wellish, and I wrote some radio scripts that were entered into the all-city contest for the best high school radio scripts, and we won several of them first. Nobody, Mr. Levine didn't get in the way. So we clearly had a sense in our amateur way of where the theater was leading us. And that, with a girl, Elaine, what was her name? Can't remember now, a good friend of ours, the three of us organized an acting troupe, and we called it the Astrians. Sic itur ad astra, and thus you shall arrive unto the stars. So we are the Astrians. And we would meet and perform for each other and rehearse at each other's homes or at the school. And then, I don't know how the connection started, but one of the plays we were doing, I think, was called Watch on the Rhine, which was a famous melodramatic play about the war, which had started by then. This is Second World War. And I think it was by Lillian Hellman, very successful Broadway show. And without any rights or anything, we were doing it. And I don't know how the connection came, but we started doing it for the USO, for service people in these social clubs organized in the city. And we toured, and this was when we were 16, and so in 17, toured some of the USOs doing Watch on the Rhine, and I think something else, I can't remember which. But that's, we were finding our way and performing, really performing. And the next, and during that time, one of the plays at Lafayette was a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Mark Twain. And the lead was played by Fred Edelman, who later became one of the Weavers. He was not in our intimate group. He was actually, I think, a year ahead of us. But he played the lead, and I played his sidekick, kind of second lead. And we had a number of scenes together. And at one point, he became annoyed with me because he felt I was stealing the scenes, which I may have been. So that kind of covers it. We had a very good head of a department, and very good teachers in it. Then, in 1944, in the February of 1944, I went to Brooklyn College. I was not yet 18, and I did a term at Brooklyn College and was drafted after that term in July, I think, July or August of 1944. But while I was at Brooklyn College, I was in my first full-length Shakespeare play. Which one was it? However, it was really a real step up professionally. It was beautifully done, wonderfully costumes, good lights, and directed by a very good director, whose name will come back to me some other time, and whose son later became a very important director in Los Angeles. But this was a man who directed very well, and it was my first real encounter in an important, not the lead, but an important role in Shakespeare. And then I was drafted.
Oh, God.
So that was as it were, the end of my childhood and adolescence. And I was drafted, as I said earlier, at Camp Upton, where my father had been inducted in the First World War in 1917, I think, and here I was in 1944, drafted, same place, which no longer existed there. Shortly after the war ended, it was turned to an important lab, the whole place. I can't remember its name, began with a B, Brookhaven or something like that. So it no longer exists. And I think there were like some enormous number of us taken into the process that day, maybe 10,000.
Oh, wow.
And by the sheer luck of God knows what, I was selected to go to the Air Force, which was part of the Army in those days. There was no independent Air Force. Most of the others went on to the infantry, I'm sure, terrible things like that. And I was sent across the country by myself in regular Pullman car accommodations, and I who had never been beyond, a few hundred miles at most beyond New York City, was now crossing the country and going down to Texas, and we went through St. Louis, and I was on a sleeper, and I ate in a dining car, things I'd never had before. And we went down to Texas, to Wichita Falls, which is just at the panhandle of Texas, north of the bulk of Texas. And it was commonly known as the asshole of the universe. It was, Texas was not what it is now then. And that's where I got my basic training. It was presumably the same basic that you got in the rest of the Army, somewhat slanted to being in the Air Force, which was certainly the best part of the Army to be in those days. But you had to jump into foxholes and run and fire and duck ammunition being fired at you, and you'd find that there was a rattler in the foxhole with you, or tarantulas or things like that. And But I was there, I guess about 6 weeks or so, in just doing basic training, that's all. And from there they put us on a train. This not a comfortable train, some beat up old train they loaded us on, and took us to the first air base I was really on, which was very close to Denver. So I was getting to see the country, as I might never have had possible before that. Denver was a much, today it has problems with its air. In those days, it was noted for having the best air in the country, and people with tuberculosis and the like would go there. And it was that kind of city. I don't remember much about Denver at all at that point. At any rate, further training. And from there, I went to McCook, Nebraska, which is on the Burlington line. It's in southern Nebraska, in the center of the state, and surrounded by endless fields of corn, I guess, or I can't even recall. Some kind of grains are growing all over the place. And when I got there, my training had been, I should say, as an armorer gunner. One of the people who sat in those bubbles at the side or the back or the front of a bomber in plastic, and I was trained to fire a caliber 50 machine gun. And part of the training was to take it apart and put it back together again. And this you had to learn to do it blindfolded. And if you didn't lose your fingers, then you were successful. And somehow I managed. So then I was sent to McCook, Nebraska, where there were lots of big planes. Eventually, while I was there, we had, of course, the old B-17, that pre-war American bomber, which was very good, a really terrific plane. And then we had the B-24s, I think B-24s, known as sometimes as the flying coffins, or flying boxcars and that sort of thing. And they had these bubbles into which we would fit ourselves and then fire our machine guns. Of course, when the enemy attacked you, the first ones they went for those of us in the bubbles. I never got there. As a matter of fact, I never flew in the Air Force. I did fly, but only as I hitched a ride to go places. But I never flew as a crew member or anything like that. Part of the problem was the actuarial tables that they worked on were wrong. They hadn't lost as many caliber 50 machine gunners, like myself, as they anticipated. So here we are backed up with too many and no place to send them, nothing to do with them, because they didn't need them to be deployed. And that was a problem there in McCook. And I looked around for something to do. And I figured, well, I'll go to special services because they handled entertainment and that sort of thing. And I went to special services, and said, do you need somebody here? And they said, no, but if you go across the street to information and education, they might need somebody. So I went across the street to information and education, and they did need an editor for the weekly based newspaper, somebody who could put it together and write articles and the like. And they said, can you write? And I said, oh yes, I've been to college one term. Have you had anything to do with newspapers? I said, yes, I worked in my high school newspaper, which was true. I was a reviewer, theater reviewer, or I didn't tell them that. And so I got the job as editor of the newspaper for the base at McCook, Nebraska, which turned out a paper once a week, a general information paper, stuff of interest to the recruits there, and information that was fed us from the 2nd Air Force Command, I think that's what it's called, which came out of Denver, and whatever our commanders wanted us to put into it. And we put in cartoons and that sort of thing. And I mean, there were feeds that we got to put it together, and then local stuff that we had to have. And while I'm at it, I should say that I did review in high school. And as a matter of fact, the first times I saw first-rate Shakespeare on Broadway there were 2 shows. One was Othello with Paul Robeson, and who was, something of a lionized until it was discovered that he was interested in communism and then blackballed. But he played in that. I don't know that I had the judgment to know if he's good or bad at that point. Retrospectively, I'm sure he wasn't very good, but he had the presence of Paul Robeson that made it work. And then, and this was really key, much more key, Macbeth with Judith Anderson and Morris Evans, 2 first-rate actors. Judith Anderson especially playing Lady Macbeth, and that really, that put a hold on me, a real one. And I reviewed those. And I may have gone backstage to do a little interview with some of them. I don't recall. At any rate, that was my introduction to first-rate, professional Broadway and London Shakespeare, those 2 shows. I think Margaret Webster, one of the early important women directors, had directed the Macbeth, I think. So that was a very good introduction. It was wonderful. And I was perhaps 16 or 17 at the time. Um, and so I was very fortunate with this newspaper at McCook because the lieutenant in charge had been a journalist, reporter, maybe some kind of sub-editor at a Hearst newspaper in, I think, Los Angeles or something like that. And he broke me in and trained me, and he was very good and patient, and he had the disciplines of a good journalist, and that was very good. He made the paper look like a Hearst paper. You know, he chose fonts that were similar to those. The Hearst papers all had very florid fonts on them, and so we had that up there. And then, unfortunately, he was moved elsewhere. I don't know if he went to Europe or the Orient or what, and was replaced by somebody who really had very little reason to be in the job at all, who came out of landed on the Mayflower family from Massachusetts. Not a bad guy, but who had brought his sports car along with him and purloined gasoline, which was rationed at that point, from the base. It was very high octane gasoline for airplanes for his sports car, and that's where his attention was. Meanwhile, in the office with me were two working other jobs, not to do with newspaper at all, with two sergeants, and one of whom came from the Midwest, from a family which well-to-do, clearly very well-to-do, which manufactured trucks someplace up in the Midwest, and he had a bad leg. Now, where he got the bad leg, or whether he enlisted and they took him in because it was the war or what, I don't know, but he was a sergeant in charge. And then another fellow who was also a sergeant, educated, went to Colgate, I believe, but who was an alcoholic. And it was there that I encountered my first real dose of antisemitism in my life from the fellow who had the bad leg. And it was clear that I, being a New York Jew, was not what he thought an American should be. And he used to speak to me as "you people" when he spoke to me. And eventually, down the line, by a long time, many months, he was instrumental in getting rid of me from that job. The other guy wouldn't have done it, except that he was a well-educated and a relatively nice guy, but entirely under the sway of this first guy. So, meanwhile, I had established friends in the office of the, I think it was the 2nd Air Force in Denver, who liked what I was doing for the newspaper, and I got some kind of citation for that. And my newspaper, what had to be, is before the newspaper could be distributed, it had to go to that Denver office to make sure that it was acceptable. So it was always ahead of, once I'd gotten it out, they had to see it before we could distribute it. And that was an interesting aspect of the job. Again, all this is broadening my sense of life, having come from Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, you know, a very provincial life. I was broadening it. I was seeing this enormous country and living with and working with people from entirely different backgrounds from all over the country. And that was interesting. I mean, important. It was as good an education as you could get. And part of the fun was the paper, once we prepared it, was printed, at least at the beginning, at a local newspaper in a small town not too far away from where we were. And I would get the copy to them on Friday, and by then their presses were not turning at that paper, and they had a contract with the Air Force to print ours. So I'd go there and I'd stay with the printer publisher of this newspaper and his family. And it was the first time I went regularly to church, to a Protestant church, and on Sunday morning. And they were very nice people, and it was lovely. And I learned, oh, he walks with me and he talks with me, tells me I am his own, etc. And then, for whatever reason, I had nothing to do with this. The contracts were changed, and it was printed in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the other side, the eastern end of the state, right close to Omaha. And so I would get on the Burlington Zephyr, that silver train, you know, that they had, and very streamlined in those days. And I had my portable typewriter, and I would sit in the bar car typing out the rest of the copy that I hadn't gotten done yet. And then we'd go to the, I think it was the newspaper, I can't recall, in Lincoln, and they'd print it up, and then they'd bundle it, and they'd get it ready, and then we'd get back on the train, and then we'd get back. Now, I used to write editorials for about life on the base and that sort of thing. And one of the problems was that in the Army, the general rule was that above the Mason-Dixon line, there would be very little color line distinction. I mean, blacks didn't serve with whites, they were in separate units, but they